As always, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, respectfully acknowledges that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including the Dakota land ceded and taken in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The history department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So I'm Sarah Chambers, chair of the History Department. I'm delighted to welcome you to another edition of our History Book Club. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Amanda Nelson, who is managing the logistics behind the scene. I'm really thrilled to welcome back two of our alumni this evening. We're going to have a discussion about the book Primitive Normativity. It's a little bit blurry the way I'm holding it up, but Primitive Normativity, Race, Sexuality, and Temporality in Colonial Kenya, published by Duke University Press by Elizabeth Williams. And I was thinking as I was reading the acknowledgement about complex and layered history of a place, and that's what we get in this really terrific book. And it's exciting to have Elizabeth here with Jessica Nammakal, both of them trained in history, but also really pursuing multidisciplinary perspectives and methodologies. Elizabeth completed her dissertation here in 2017 and was an active member of the workshop in the comparative history of women, gender, and sexuality, and did a minor in feminist studies. And she's now an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Kentucky. And she'll be in conversation with Jessica Nammakal, who completed her degree here in 2013, is associate professor of practice in international comparative studies at Duke University, and presented her own book here several years back in the book club, Unsettling Utopia, The Making and Unmaking of French India. And so we're delighted to have her back to engage in this conversation. So the way it works is that I will first invite Elizabeth to tell us a bit about the book, anything she wants to sort of fill us in on about what it's about or how it sort of got to be a book. And then we'll shift to a conversation between Jessica and Elizabeth about the book. And when we get to about 6:40 or so, we'll start taking questions from the audience. Anytime you think of a question, you can go ahead and pop it in the chat. And when we get to that time, I will read out those questions for our guests. So with that, I will turn things over to Elizabeth.
Okay. Thank so much to the history department for inviting me, and thanks to Jessica for agreeing to be my interlocutor today. And thanks to all of you for coming. This has been a really fun workshop for me because I get to see the finished project of all of these projects that I saw when they were in their infancy or perhaps childhood, tween years. What have you. Yes, so I'm really excited to be here today. So I'm going to share the screen so I can show you a little PowerPoint. And can everybody see that? Okay, great. There's a bunch of images in the PowerPoint. I'm not going to describe them for the sake of time, but if there's anything that sticks out at you and you want me to go back later, we can chat about it. So yes, so this project started actually when I was in Helena's class, and I started looking at the contemporary literature about Mau Mau rebels. So this was a anti-colonial rebellion that happened in Kenya in 1953. And I was looking at all of these accounts from the 50s of settlers and officials stressing that the Mau Mau, one, engaged in all kinds of sort of deviant sexual practices, and two, that this is how you knew they weren't real Africans, that they were in fact sort of contaminated Africans that had been that had essentially like gone crazy as a result of their exposure to civilization. So this really stuck out to me because so much of the literature on sexuality and imperialism talked about how colonized people were depicted as deviant. And in this case, the consensus seemed to be that uncontaminated Africans had this sort of universally highly normative sexuality, where practices like rape, prostitution, pedophilia, and even masturbation were completely not present. So this sort of sparked a bunch of questions for me. Like, first, I wanted to know, like, why was this so different than other histories of sexuality and imperialism that I had read? I wanted to know how far back this narrative went. And I also wanted to think about, like, why is it that they're talking about this group that is like one of the most subaltern groups in Kenya as the normative, as sexually normative group? Like, what does that tell us about how normativity and deviance operate in race-making projects? So essentially what I discovered as I sort of went backwards in time is that from almost the beginning of the Kenyan colonial project, both settlers and colonial administrators adopted this kind of discourse that I term primitive normativity. And this is a narrative that holds that Kenyan Africans were unfettered by the moral restraints that more civilized Europeans placed upon themselves. But because Africans supposedly never had to suppress their sexual drives, experts believe them to be incapable of developing the forms of sexual neuroses, including hysteria, homosexuality, and frigidity that seem to be plaguing European communities at the turn of the century. And this turned into sort of a handy discourse because colonists were then able to argue that Africans had to be protected from forces like urbanization, Western style education, and political participation, which would expose them to forms of civilized sexual deviance. And not coincidentally, those are some of the things that tend to produce the most vocal and effective critics of colonial rule. So in providing a genealogy of this rhetoric of primitive normativity, I'm suggesting that normativity and deviance are produced both in relation to each other and through other vectors of power. And in developing this term, primitive normativity, I'm trying to point to the degree to which ideas about African sexuality were tied to an evolutionary narrative that placed African peoples in a prior moment in time. So in this rhetoric, their sexuality was normative, both because it was supposedly absent of deviant practices, but also because it was understood to be like the appropriate sexuality for their prior stage of evolutionary development. And in understanding how this operated, I think it's helpful to think about Kenya as a settler colony and also as like a particularly weird kind of settler colony. So Kenya has a small but disproportionately powerful white settler minority that's basically in charge of like most of the politics, all the land, but it is still a crown colony, meaning it's governed from the colonial office. And the official line of Kenya is that the settlers are holding the land in trust until the indigenous people are sufficiently civilized to be able to inherit their own land and resources. So in this context, when you have a group of settlers that want to maintain control of the land and resources and want to pass on those to their own children, right? Having a narrative that allows you to oppose anything that could be used as sort of proof or evidence of the civilization of African people is really a helpful way to forestall the kind of temporal promise of trusteeship. So there's two kinds of like temporal slippage that tend to be discussed a lot in these sources. And key to both of them is the idea that there are two separate sort of timescapes occurring in this same space. So the one of them is the timescape of the indigenous people, which is supposedly in the past. And the other one is the timescape of the settlers, which is supposedly in the present. And there's two ways in which people sort of jumping time can become problematic. So the first one is called detribalization, and this is the word that both settlers and officials use to describe Africans who had urbanized, who had been exposed to Western style education, who wore Western style clothes, who became involved in trade unions or other kind of political movements. And the rhetoric around this was that detribalized natives had sort of lost touch with their traditions and hence were responsible for like everything bad in the colony. So like all the crime in the colony was blamed on them, but especially any evidence of sexually deviant behavior was blamed on detribalized Africans. And the idea was that they had civilized too fast and that this had caused some kind of like mental instability. And this is in fact the official explanation that's given for Mau Mau. It's that the rebels had detribalized too quickly and hence it had caused like mass psychopathy that resulted in the rebellion. The other kind of temporal slip that people are worried about at this time is the idea of degeneration. So in the 19th century, we have all kinds of European powers that start getting really worried that the people that they want to be procreating, like middle-class white people, are supposedly developing all these sexual neuroses and therefore not going to be able to produce more babies. And these neuroses are also described of as degeneration, as sort of like a slipping back in time. So this rhetoric of primitive normativity is helpful to these settlers because it allows them to present any kind of modernizing on the part of Africans as something that's going to be sexually contaminating. And it is something that allows them to reframe their own sexuality as something that is improved by contact with the space of Kenya, i.e. it helps heal their kind of over-civilized sexual neuroses by putting them back in touch with this sort of like fecund land of like rifts and lions and all this sort of stuff, right? Okay, so I wanted to just talk briefly about some of the literatures that I was drawing on here. So one big part of it was settler colonial studies, especially works by people like Scott Laurie Morganson and Mark Rifkin that has talked about the idea of like a specific settler colonial sexuality. But the scholarship on settler colonialism in the US and Canada doesn't always translate super well to African settler colonies because while indigenous populations were targeted for elimination in North American settler colonies, in many African settler colonies, there is sort of a biopolitical project to preserve African populations as labor, but to control their movement throughout the colonies. A second body of scholarship that I was building a lot on was Black feminist theories, especially theories that think about how sexuality and race combine. So one especially important idea was Kathy Cohen's work, where she talks about heterosexuals on the outside of heterosexuality. Essentially, she's talking about how race can cause sexual behaviors that are heterosexual to suddenly become read as queer, as sort of non-normative. So I built on sort of that idea, but also other work by people like Hortense Spillers, Bell Hooks, other folks there. And then the last sort of body of work that I drew from was queer African studies, especially this book here, Frottage by Kagura Macharia, which I'm like low-key obsessed with. And I think this is a really important book, partly because Macharia is one of the people, along with Anne Laura Stoller, that has argued that this sort of Foucauldian couplet of like the four problematic kind of sexualities, the masturbator, the Malthusian couple, the homosexual, and like the hysteric frigid woman, right, are all produced in relation to a fifth, which is the primitive, the colonized subject. And so in my work, I'm thinking a lot about how these kinds of ideas of like European sexuality and primitive sexuality are always constituted in relation to each other. And since we're historians, I wanted to give you some discussion of my sources as well. So I looked at documents from three main archives: the British National Archives, the Kenyan National Archives, and the Rhodes House collection in Oxford. And I looked at sort of like standard kind of documents like memos from the Colonial Office. I looked at like gazettes. I looked at newspapers, but I also looked at memoirs, ethnographies, and I also have a chapter on romance novels and how they imagine the space of Kenya. So I think I will just stop sharing now and hand it over to Jessica.
Hi, sorry. I just said, hi, Elizabeth. This book is wonderful. I have a sick baby in the background, so I am apologizing for the he's with his grandma, but there might be some crying. So Elizabeth, congratulations. This is such a fantastic book. I was so excited to be asked to comment on it, right? And to be able to have the chance to sit and read with it and think about it. And I've been sort of thinking, loved being able to think with you over the past week and have this conversation as I've had a chance to read it. So I am so glad to be doing this. You touched on a lot of the things that stood out to me in your presentation here, especially sort of the novel approach to bringing these different literatures into the study of Africa. And I know that that's not an uncomplicated task, right? So you already, I was going to start by asking you sort of you talked about your approach, but what were some of the sort of struggles you had with that? And has there been any discussion that's come to you as a result of saying calling the people of Kenya indigenous or sort of mapping this, what is usually seen as a white dominion or North American sort of theory onto the study of Kenya. So I would actually just love to hear you talk a little bit more about what that experience has been like working sort of within the field of African history as a place to start.
Yes, thank you. So those have not been the sort of pushback points that I've gotten thus far, interestingly enough, but a lot of the pushback that I got was about this not being a book that is about resistance and not being a book that is about like materiality and like social history, that it's a discursive history instead. And so I think one of the things that I struggled with the longest is like trying to figure out what my answer to that concern was. And I think I eventually landed on the idea that this is a book about sexuality, but not about sex. And that the fact that people kept wanting me to tell them what kind of sex were people really having, the sort of persistence of that question started to make me think that there was something else going on here, and that there was some kind of impulse that like discourse doesn't belong in African history, that African history can only be about like proletariat struggling against against domination and resisting and that kind of thing. So I think once I sort of conceded the point that if you want to know something about sex, you're not going to find it here, that opened up some spaces for me to think. I remember specifically submitting an article that is one of the chapters in this book, and to the Journal of the History of Sexuality, and I got a review that said like, this is just people talking about sex, so I don't think it's about sexuality. And I was like, that's what that's what this is, right? So that was one of the biggest sort of intellectual hurdles.
I the other thing I wanted to hear you talk about from the start here is how you conceptualized and started to work with this theory of primitive normativity. Specifically, it's interesting how many layers you have here, right? You have the people in the metropole creating culture, right? All the usual suspects creating discourses around sexuality and deviance. You have colonial officials in the colonies. You have the settler class. You have the Indians, right? You have the Indian crisis in 1923, and then within the Indians, you have the wealthy Indians, and then you have the indentured Indians who are not fans of each other, right? Or don't want to be associated with each other. Like side question, I also was wondering if there was, and you didn't write about this. I imagine you didn't come across anything, but in the South Asian labor migration, indentured labor migration to the Caribbean, there's a lot of discussion about sexuality within that. So, like, was that part of the conversation? In Kenya, maybe not. That we can bracket that. But then within all these layers, what I was really thinking about is this question of the evolutionary time that you have within this concept. If the evolutionary time is a teleological time, and the end of that for the colonized is self-determination or sovereignty, right? If that is sort of what is imagined by the colonial center as what they might be um, hoping to achieve, and we don't really get from the book what the Kenyans maybe were hoping to achieve within that. Um, but if that is sort of the theological end of it, what is the sort of moral? Is deviance desirable? I'll put it that way, right? If that is what is going to get you to self-rule, right? I mean, it's Gandhi is not a part of this. I can't believe I'm talking about Gandhi. Somebody call Ajay. But like, his relationship to sexuality, in relationship to self-determination within the Indian question, like I can't not think of that in here, right? Because that is so much a part of his sort of um, role of that, right? Like, what is the role of deviance then in sort of an anti-colonialism, maybe, or something like this? That makes sense.
Okay. Yes.
There was a lot there.
So I think the first part of the question about like sort of how I conceptualized this, I had a lot to do with reading about like a revision in the idea of primitiveness that's happening like from the mid 19th century to like basically the period when Kenya is a colony, where there's this sort of revival of the idea that like primitivity might actually be the cure for all of like Europe's social ills. So we start getting like cubism, we get like Europeans getting really into jazz, we get like Boy Scouts, we get national parks, right? We get all of these sort of spaces where Europeans are sort of tapping back into primitivity, and that like primitivity and sexuality get sort of like reconsidered at this moment. And one thing that was sort of shocking was how much that anthropological and sexological discourse filtered down. So I would see settlers and also officials saying the same stuff that people were saying in like ethnographic or sexological spaces. And I think part of this is because this narrative ended up being useful to them, and part of this was because they wanted to be perceived as experts on the African mind. And so they tended to present themselves as like ethnographers a lot of the time. So a few of them were, but most of them were not, right? And then that question about if deviance is desirable, the question, I mean, I think the answer is yes, if you're white. And if you are not white, then deviance or normativity can work against you. Like there's not, it's like a no-win game, right? Because in this case, like the the settlers are explicitly saying, like, we're more deviant than you, and you're going to learn bad habits from contact with us. And that means you better stay in the reserves or on like white-owned farms, right? So they're able to sort of flip the narrative. And that's one place where I felt like the work by like Kathy Cohen was really helpful, because she helps us understand that these categories of like normativity and deviance don't really have a any kind of solid foundation in themselves, that they're always sort of produced through other categories like race, right? So yes, that's my answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if we can just dwell a minute on the primitive part of it. I think to me, a lot of the sort of the national parks and the Boy Scouts and all of this is about controlling nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like, what is the primitive for you in primitive normativity, right? Is it like this dark Africa, like biologically untamed sort of narrative, or is it a like we are the civilized who can go and tame nature? I mean, do you know what I mean? Like, what is primitive to you in this?
Yeah, I think it's more like a sort of like Freudian thing where there's an idea that they're like it's the recapitulation hypothesis thing, like the idea that each individual organism undergoes the entire evolutionary history of its species. And that's an idea that's created by people like Ernst Haeckel in the 19th century, but then Freud like steals everything he writes from evolutionary anthropology. And so we get this new understanding of primitivity as something that like lives kind of in the background of the heads of civilized people to various degrees, right? Like it's probably more to the forefront in like women, it's more to the forefront in working class people, right? But it's always sort of in the subconscious. And in this moment when primitivism is sort of having its moment, that idea of like tapping back into that thing that's like hidden in your subconscious becomes seen as like super desirable. And I think that's the framework in which the association of primitivity with sexual normativity becomes possible. Because the sort of explanation for why deviant practices were supposedly absent from traditional African cultures was that they did not have to repress any sexual urges because they were allowed to have sex. And hence there was no chance for them to become neurotic because they didn't have to restrain themselves, which is obviously bullshit, right? But is also like useful for this particular narrative.
So does the normative in that then in this specific like geography and timescape, obviously the aligning timescapes here, is the normativity then like just heterosexual reproductive sex?
Yes, but they'll go even further. So they claim that prostitution is unknown in East Africa prior to colonization. They say they don't even have a word for it. Jomo
Mhm.
Kenyatta goes so far to say it's the Gikuyu only have sex in the missionary position. There's a lot of discourse that like rape does not occur in indigenous societies. Um, and there's also discussion about like masturbation, incest, like all those things, pedophilia do not occur in
Mhm.
these societies when they're uncontaminated, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean I think you do such a wonderful job of tying that to I mean I think the time thing I really the part I appreciated it about it the most was how you tied it to contemporary discourse in Kenya, right? About how, I mean, this is what I was getting to with the theological time question too, is, when you have, and I know you cite Rahuel's book, Out of Time, which I am a big fan of. Also, this question of a pre-colonial purity, right? Like, where does that idea come from? And I think you did just such a wonderful job of showing the construction of how that could happen, right? And I do, I mean, I will, something I have really taken from this book is being able to show just how complicated the overlapping sort of sources are in here, from the novels to the sexology, to the to the legal cases, all contribute to this idea that there is evolutionary sort of colonial time. So I don't have a hat, but my hat off to on that. Okay, so I will ask you one or two other questions before we move to your fan club here. The other question I want to ask you, I guess, in the beginning of in your introduction, you talk about how people wanted you to talk about sex, which you just told us, and that you were working in archives, you had what you had, you didn't feel like you could go and interview sort of elder Kenyans about their sex lives. So I do want you to talk about clearly throughout the book, you're thinking about the question of voice, right? So you have that in the beginning, you talk about it in the conclusion. I pull out a quote on page 90 where you were talking about this question of authentic voices, right? And I want to hear more from you on that. I mean, if you'll allow me to read from your book, oh, look, I'll open it. I told Liz I bought the book, so full price. I didn't use the Duke code. Okay, so you wrote, okay, middle of page 90. Indeed, settlers believed that part of their obligation as trustees of African welfare was to determine which African voices could be considered authentic. For the historian, this is also a reminder that locating and highlighting African voices will not allow us to access any authentic truth about colonized perspectives. African voices, like all others, are mediated by and produced in relation to discursive regimes, and Africans occupied complicated and contradictory positions with colonial hierarchies. And I wonder if you can just talk about, I mean, I absolutely understand where you're coming from with this authentic question. Like, what is an authentic voice? Is there such a thing? Obviously, it's like given some sort of special privilege when we're talking about, people are, where are the African voices? Like, what's going on here? Um, but if the settlers and some places, the Indians are really, and then you have a few elite in here, Kenyatta, creating the discourse, right? Are there other voices you wish you could have accessed, right? Do you think there was another discourse that's out there? What do you think this is a complete picture of, I guess? Like at the end of the day, what is this book a representation of? And we can take the question of authenticity off the table. I think like we can agree there's no authenticity. There's no purity, right?
Yeah.
But what do you think this is the story of?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a complete representation of anything, but I do think it's an interesting case study in how sexuality is used as an alibi of empire and how the role it plays in racializing projects. I think when I'm thinking about like this sort of urge to find the like authentic, pure African voice that is completely disconnected from discourse and has no motivation or agenda on its own. I think this was one of the things that was sort of bothering me because I kept finding sources that would sort of explain away African speech that sort of didn't align with their argument, basically saying like, this is why this person doesn't really count. Or would present people like Kenyatta, who's got like a pretty clear agenda as somebody that's just sort of speaking as an ethnographic subject rather than as an ethnographer and as somebody that has like he has a political goal, right? Like and he's clearly like picked up on this discourse in a society, he's going to use it to his own ends, right? So yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there are other ways to tell this story, but what I ended up with was basically like a story about settler colonial discourse and how it uses sexuality as a way to achieve its goals.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe I'll end here. wonder if you can tell us just a little bit more about how you see this concept sort of furthering the project of thinking about queer time and anti-colonialism, or queer time and decolonization, right? Like, how does that? I mean, I like how I love how you build up to the Mau Mau, right? And I like how you told us how this started in Helena's class, right? And that it was thinking about this. You said people are asking, where's the resistance? And of course, you have resistance actors in there, right? And sort of there's a sense of time in that, like we're getting to the end of the settler colony in a way, right? Throughout it. Um, so how do you think the concept of queer time works through that sort of narrative of pre-colonial colonization, decolonization? What does queer time do to that?
Yeah, I think that like the language of queer time is helpful for me because it's a way of thinking about like how temporality is one tied to ideas about normativity and deviance, and two tied to ideas about sexuality. And I think like the sort of basic premise of colonialism is that there's multiple timescapes in like happening at the same time, and that's pretty queer, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
also one of the reasons why I wanted to use that language was because there's been this sort of split in queer African studies where there's one kind of scholarship that is trying to prove that there were queer people prior to colonization, which is really tapping into some of that idea about like authentic Africanness, i.e., if like I can't find somebody who is gay and like 1700, then nobody can be allowed to be gay now, right? Because nobody can be allowed to change, nobody can like be allowed to be impacted by any of the cultural events since then. And then the other bit of scholarship has been to be like, well, actually, it's homophobia, that's the colonial import. But it seemed to me that like if we moved away from talking about like homosexuality and thought about queerness more broadly, like and normativity more broadly, it might help us get out of this kind of impasse.
Yeah, yeah. It leads to incredibly reductive conversations. You would probably agree. I mean, where do you think that, what is your read using your term? And you give us a little bit with Obama's visit to Kenya and his sort of like, I don't agree with your policies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's that's such an interesting moment, of course, because he is part of the diaspora, right? And so to have him come in and do this is extra interesting. But like, given this and given your really interesting theorization here, like how do you think how do you read what's going on right now in terms of like um, queer politics in this part of Africa?
Yeah, this is something where Raoul Rao and Masharia both are helpful because
Yeah.
they are able to help us understand how homophobia can operate as anti-colonialism
Oh yeah.
because of this whole history, right?
Mhm.
Because of this kind of discourse. Um, that if you've got like somebody showing up and telling you how backward you are and how you're doing everything wrong and how you're pre-modern, right? It's our sort of reiteration of that kind of like colonial civilizing trope. And in that particular context, um, homophobia can be really effective, right? As a like anti-colonial kind of stance. And I think that we see that like all over empire,
Oh
like
yeah, it happens in India all the time.
yeah, every time they step in and are like, this thing that you're doing, especially this thing that you're doing in your families or around sexuality or around women, this is totally barbarous. That thing becomes like a opportunity for resistance, right? It takes
Mhm.
on these new meanings. So I think if we're going to understand how that operates, it's helpful to have a longer look at like how these discussions came to be.
Yes, and you did that. Thank you. All right. I think we should let your fans ask you questions.
Yeah, feel free to start putting questions in the chat. So, Anna Clark, I love the nuanced answer about Kenyatta and the broadening out of the queer normative analysis beyond homosexuality. Not a question, just an appreciation. Yeah. Yeah, and I would echo, what Jekka said in terms of how you know, deftly you are dealing with these layers of complexity and different temporalities. And for me, as someone coming who, has focused on colonialism in a very different time and place, right? Spanish colonialism in the Americas, where everything is totally different, right? The arguments about sexuality and primitiveness and all that are and so it was so great to see the ways the real flexibility of these discourses that fit into particular times and places. And as you said, even within Africa, they're not all the same, that there are certain specificities about Kenya. And I was thinking back to a couple questions ago about this question of voices. And so, as you say, most of your book is showing these sort of relational discourses. Okay, if the colonizer is going to put forth this, then there could be a sort of counter hegemonic discourse about, sexuality termed in a different way. And of course, what we end up getting, particularly, we get some of the British women, settler women's voices, and we get a lot of male voices from both African society and the settler society, and very little from an African woman's voice. And I was thinking about the one trial you have where a colonial administrator is accused of um, sort of corrupting young women by taking them from their communities and into his household and marrying them in some sort of supposedly traditional way through payment of bride wealth. And the sort of way in which so many people are trying to speak for these young women, whether it's other Africans or a woman of the middle class there in the settler society who's very critical of this administrator and so forth. And then there's just these little passages where we think we're getting maybe the testimony of the women themselves. And what's interesting there is that it sort of suggests that there is a space where conversations are going on that aren't in this same relational thing. Like I just kind of got a sense that these women are having their own conversations, but we don't get to hear them, right? And that they may not have any interest in engaging in these relational kind of hegemonic and counter-hegemonic discourses. So I guess
Yeah.
mine is also just an appreciation and not a question, but
Yeah, and even where I have their testimony, there's all these questions about like, is this what they're actually saying? Because it's probably not in, it's definitely not in English, right? It's
right,
been translated
exactly.
from something.
Yeah.
And they're using these words that are like part of Kisetla, which is this dialect that the settlers use. And so I'm like, is this being translated in ways that the settlers are like, what frameworks are being placed upon their testimony? But yeah, even within that, there are still these like little moments where you'll get like peeks at their actual experience. Like one of the girls said, like, I went back to live with this administrator because I knew there was another girl there and I didn't want her to be alone. And that's one of the moments where it's like, that feels real, right? And certainly not like unmediated, but yeah, I think it just made me think about how hard it is to actually get to sources that might speak to people's actual experience.
Yeah, but we know those women are having conversations that are
Mhm.
not accessible to us, but at least that gives us a glimpse of, oh, those are happening, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So anyone else have a question from the audience? while we're waiting, maybe for some questions, I don't know if you're starting to think about what you might be working on next, Elizabeth, or, well, here's a question. So we'll bracket that. Brooke is putting in a question. Did you have a sense of how the colonists were picking up on the sexologist slash anthropologists discourses? In other words, any sense of how these ideas are traveling? And then she's also curious to hear how the political context in which you were researching and writing had an impact on your interests and investment in the project or your sense of its implications. I'm picking up here on the comment regarding Obama in Kenya and other discussions of LGBTQ plus rights in East Africa that were taking place. And also, it's just good to see and hear from you, she says.
Thanks, Brooke, and thanks for coming. The first one about how they were picking up on this discourse, I think some of it was that they were actually reading stuff, but also a lot of these anthropological discourses are being written by either colonial officials or settlers. So like that chapter that Dr. Chambers was just talking about is there's two ethnographers like on the ground that are like super involved in it. And also at that time, you didn't really have to like know anything to be an ethnographer, right? You could just sort of claim that you are an ethnographer by virtue of the fact that you're like a white person that lives in East Africa, right? And sort of claiming ethnographic knowledge becomes like really a key part of settler identity in particular, because they're like, I know my Africans, I know the African mind, I understand how they work better than all of these critics of colonialism. And so that kind of claim to ethnographic knowledge is sort of important to their presentation and their understanding of themselves. So they have, I guess, sort of an investment in being able to talk about things in this framework. And then about the political context, honestly, I just thought it was interesting for the sake of itself. Like it was just interesting to me. It's, I think, good that it has some kind of relevance to the contemporary moment. I don't really imagine it's going to be like helpful to like activists in any way. Like it's a pretty, I don't know, nerdy study, but it is nice to be able to think about this as having like some relationship to the present.
Can I promote that more? I mean, I think it was I know it's like happenstance to you, but I think it was really important. I think you said closed the circle. Did you say that in the chapter? Something like in the conclusion, it comes full circle. People keep saying, I'm going to close the circle to me these days. But I mean, I think it really did because one of the questions, as through reading it, it's like, okay, yes, I totally buy that these discourses are happening. Like, settler colonial people are going to say crazy shit. Like, they're going to be racist. They're going to do all of these things. You know, it fits in line with a lot of this. I mean, I do the sort of flipping the not over hypersexualized but normative thing was like new and really interesting. But I do, to me, like that end point did bring me to this question of like, but did it matter to people who live in post-colonial Kenya? Right. And it's like, yeah, like these discourses really do. I think you showed that. Like they travel, they're still there, right, through this sort of Kenyatta moment that it is still there. So to me, it was actually a really relevant and poignant moment in there.
Yeah. So we are getting some more questions now. Kafui McKenna is a first year graduate student in our program from South Africa. And she says, thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing and Jessica for the questions. I wanted to ask how sexual violence was defined and how they concluded that it was not present. I would also like to ask how women were spoken about in the archives. Were there any forms of sexual socialization highlighted in these communities?
Okay. So the sort of first question about how sexual violence was defined, to some extent, the sort of argument on the part of settlers is that there was no sexual violence in these communities. One, because there were sanctioned outlets for premarital sex, so nobody had to rape anybody, which is a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of how sexual violence works. There is also an idea that because African women were supposedly treated as chattel in their own societies, that like the offense was too great because it was like a property offense to the men in her family. And so the men in the family would never let it happen, or the punishments would be so great that nobody would do this. And this shows up especially in, I have a chapter about a bunch of investigations of interracial assaults on mostly European, but also some Asian children, where the sort of standard line is like, this must be something that they learned from the mothers. The mothers must have been behaving with too much familiarity towards their domestic servants, because they would never do this if they were uncontaminated, right? So that rhetoric shows up. And one interesting sort of bit about that, it's so when I went to the archives, I was looking for anything that said anything about sexual violence. And in this folder that's about sexual violence, it was almost exclusively white or Asian victims. You almost never talked about African women. That essentially they're presented, and this is where Hortense Spillers comes in, as sort of not having any sexuality or gender at all, right? They're just presented as sort of like chattel that have no ability to consent or not. And since any sort of questions about African women's sexuality are sort of considered moot by colonial authorities. And then the question about sexual socialization, they do get really wigged out about initiation. And there's something called the circumcision crisis in the 1930s, where basically all the missionaries are like, you all get sex ed during these initiation ceremonies, and therefore like we got to stamp it out because this is like barbaric, right? So there is concern about like sort of indigenous systems of sex ed that show up, but I don't talk too much about that because that's one of the things that has been written about quite a bit in Kenyan history.
Yeah, thank you. And Helena had a question too. Is the issue of voice not also a problem of the methodologies of history, in particular African history, where it also becomes, by way of gathering evidence, a way of relativizing African intellectual thought or directing it towards questions of resistance, agency, etc.?
Yes, I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding you. You can tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but for instance, I kept there was a bunch of sort of loyalist Africans who, during the Indian crisis in 1923, wrote into various papers being like, no, 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 we want the white people. We don't want the Asian people in charge of us, right? And I saw a number of other scholars that had written about this being like, oh, well, they don't count. Here's why they don't count. Like, but I think it's sort of more helpful to be like, well, they also count because this particular group of people had were benefiting from colonial rule, right? And so they're certainly not speaking for all people. And there's a reason why their letters end up in the settler newspaper and not anybody else's. There's a reason why they're able to write in English, right? And these things are all sort of connected. So yeah, I think actually you said something once when I came back from an interview where I gave a really bad answer, where you said there's like a dichotomy where like Africa has voices and everybody else gets discourse. And so like part of what I wanted to think about is like, no, there's discourse happening here too.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And just again to sort of say what's so interesting about the way you approach the research and writing up and these complexities, these different temporal coexisting time periods, and and really the complexity of the demographic makeup, let's say, of Kenya at this time, that we have, you know, settlers coming from South Africa and into Kenya. We have Indians coming from, so there's all this movement within the empire. And that's bringing all these different conversations into it. And I was thinking about also the one chapter where you're looking at the novels by a female author, and she's British, but born in India, but then comes to Kenya because she marries someone, I think, who's a colonial administrator in Kenya. But maybe then, and then I'm not sure where she's doing her writing, but chooses then to set the novels in Kenya rather than India, which presumably she may have known better. And so the meanings that that would have for her readers back in the metropole. So there's, I mean, the layers are so, and it's, you know, so complex, and yet it was really clear. I mean, I could, you made the complexity understandable in a way, or something like that, if I can put it that way.
Yeah,
So
and
really
shout
well.
out to Patricia Lorsan, who also has written about the same weirdo, Nora Strange, appropriately named. Yeah, that could be, that's another sort of place to look at that weirdness there. I also want to give a shout out to the cover artist. So the cover is by a Kenyan artist named Swoya Kambia. And for me, like, the reason why I picked this was because of this question about voices. And she makes these by covering herself with like soot and ink and then pressing herself up against walls. And to me, it was saying something about like how there's these archival traces, but they're always distorted. Like they're always showing up in shapes that aren't the actual shape.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great that you found that image to crystallize some of those ideas. So, you know, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing this fascinating book with us. Thank you so much, Jessica, for your really productive questions and comments. And I'll say that our next book club will be November 20th, and we're going to have our a colleague in our department, Zozan Pelavan, who specializes in environmental history, and will be presenting on her book that will be hot off the presses at that time, The Political Ecology of Violence, Peasants, and Pastoralists in the Last Ottoman Century. And so Amanda has put a link to that if you want to go ahead and sign up for that one. And thank you as well to those of you who have come. We also often put a link in case anyone is moved to make a donation to our graduate fellowship fund, because of course that's where it all starts, right? Is in this excellent work that our graduate students are doing now, and then they'll be able to produce these books that we can come back to and visit later. And with that, I think we'll close out the sort of official time of the book club. But if you would like, Elizabeth and Jessica are both able to stay on for a little while. So if you just want to, we'll be able to unmute you and do a little greet and more informal conversation as well. So thank you so much.